Hi, everybody. How are you? I am Christiana Livniadis. I am Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Thank you so very much for joining us tonight for Gay Places, a virtual walking tour, which will take us through the locations and interesting people and organizations that have been featured so far in our Gay Places blog. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started to the main event. As you see on the screen for tonight's program, we are going to be keeping our videos off and our microphones muted so that we can best absorb and enjoy the information that Dr. Jeff is going to be giving us. Here in Zoom, you can use the Zoom chat function to ask any questions that you have at any moment, and we strongly encourage and want to hear your questions. We are also live streaming onto Facebook at this moment. So if you are on Facebook, same thing applies. If you have questions, just type them away, and I have a coworker here, Tia, working to help make sure that we catch all of the questions that anyone might have. And with that, let us get started. But before I hand it off to our distinguished speaker, let me just introduce you to who we are at Preservation Buffalo Niagara. We are your local preservation advocacy organization. Our mission is to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture and historic legacy, and to connect people to the places that they love in Western New York. Our name has Buffalo and Niagara in it, but our service area actually includes the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So we are not just here, we are here for the entire region. And when we say that we're here for the entire region, there is a lot of services that we can provide. When we talk about the work that we do, we generally divide it into 4 different categories: education, technical service, advocacy, and community development. Education, tonight is an example of that, whether it is virtual or in person. We are here ready and willing to give you the knowledge and insight that you need to better understand our historic built environment and then be able to better protect our historic built environment. Technical service, preservation, PBN staff is here ready to answer any questions you have as a steward of a historic property or a lover of a historic property. That can be something that's a material type question. You have questions about how to repair or fix or do something on your structure. Or maybe it's a preservation planning question that you have. How do you do landmarking nominations? How do you get onto the National Register? And then when it comes to advocacy and community development, those 2 things are basically the same thing, but how we divide it up is advocacy is when we are taking the lead in trying to advocate for the preservation or protection of a resource or for legislation that will advance preservation efforts. And then community development is where we come into your community and give you the tools you need to be in charge of your preservation destiny. Again, as I said before, PBN, our service area is 5 quite large counties. So we cannot be at every meeting to speak in support of preservation. And certainly now during a pandemic, we really can't be at every meeting to support preservation. So making sure that you and your community have the tools you need to protect and preserve your historic resources is very important to us. And when I say us, I'm talking about these smiling faces in front of you. Our executive director is Jessie Fisher. There's me, Mary, Tia, who is on the line to help us catch questions on Facebook. Tabitha and Bridge round out the team. And I would like to thank our sponsors for this program tonight. Our educational programming is made possible by the support of Erie County Cultural Funding, and currently also made possible by support by Humanities New York and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and certainly our PBN membership. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization. So it is only through those membership dollars that we are able to do the wide advocacy work that we do at the office. I would also like to mention and thank the many of you who, in registering for tonight's program, also took that step to make a donation in support of it. So thank you so very much for supporting in that way. It's important to understand when we're talking, as Dr. Jeff gets into his lecture, our Gay Places initiative is not just a blog and some lectures here and there. Our goal is to take this documentation and take this research and to then enact preservation planning steps afterwards, so that we're not just talking about these places that hold immense significance and history to us, but that we are taking the steps to protect and preserve them for future generations. So your membership dollars and support tonight through your registration support our work to do those things. And with that, we will now turn to our presenter, who, if you would give me a moment, I want to pull up his official bio so I give him his proper due credits and maybe take a glass of water too. Excuse me, just so that y'all know, I literally just came out of a 3.5-hour meeting right before this started. So I do need several beverages, more than just water. Ha ha ha. Anyway, I digress. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jeffrey Yovanoni. He is a historian, writer, educator, and third-generation Buffalonian. He holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Buffalo. He is a lecturer in history and the coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program at SUNY Fredonia, broadly specializing in gender and LGBTQ studies. His specific areas of focus include multi-ethnic American history, LGBTQ history of the United States, LGBTQ community history, United States social movements, oral history, and public history. He is currently at work on a book about Buffalo's gay liberation movement entitled Rust to Dreams, Gay Liberation in Buffalo, New York, 1969 to 1984. I am very excited to read that book and have that book come out. I've actually maybe had a sneak preview at a chapter, and it's going to be absolutely phenomenal. So Dr. Jeff, if you want to show us your face and join us in this presentation.
Hi, everyone. So I want to start by saying happy LGBTQ History Month, and thanking PBN especially for giving me a platform to discuss LGBTQ history, and also the Madeline Davis Archives at SUNY Buffalo State, in particular Dan DeLandro, head of archives and special collections, the honors program at SUNY Fredonia, where I teach, and then of course my LGBTQ elders, who we couldn't be here talking about LGBTQ history without them. And I also want to dedicate tonight's tour to Merni Kern, who actually passed away this past weekend, and her story is featured in this tour. And the oral history that I did with her was instrumental in helping me to understand the beginnings of the gay liberation movement in Buffalo. So this virtual tour combines the history of our built environment with LGBTQ social, cultural, and oral history. And if you could go to this next slide. So why LGBTQ historic preservation, right? Why combine the history of the built environment with LGBTQ history? Well, I'm going to give us three primary reasons, specifically in the context of Western New York LGBTQ history. So first of all, the National Register of Historic Places, which is part of the National Park Service that was created by the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. The criteria that the National Register gives shows us that there's a connection between identity and place. So it's not just about properties that have architectural significance, but sites can also be on the National Register for their association with persons that are significant to our past, and also properties that are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broader patterns of our history. So there's a connection between identity and place. It helps us to understand who we are, where we came from, and of course that's true of LGBTQ people as well. However, there's very few sites on the NRHP specifically for their connection to LGBTQ history. And a theme study that came out of the National Park Service in 2016 reported that LGBTQ sites make up only 0.08% of the 2,500 National Historic Landmarks and only 0.005% of the more than 90,000 places on the NRHP. And third, if we look at Western New York specifically, there are no sites on the NRHP specifically for their connection to LGBTQ history. There's a few sites that are on the National Register because they're part of a historic district, but not specifically because of the LGBTQ story that's attached to them. And this is, and if we look at LGBTQ historic sites in general, there is virtually none in the Rust Belt, so the deindustrialized Great Lakes and Midwest region. There's one in Chicago. However, Chicago is different from mid-sized industrial cities like Buffalo or Detroit or Pittsburgh or Cleveland. And part of this lack of representation is due to the bi-coastal narrative and bi-coastal focus of LGBTQ history. And what that narrative says is that LGBTQ history took place or takes place in large cities on the US coast. It's people in those locations that have been the driving force behind the progress and rights that we've achieved, and things that have happened elsewhere kind of because of a trickle down effect from these large coastal cities. Of course, as we'll see on our tour tonight, this is not the case. And I like to think of this through a framework that the historian Hugh Ryan gives. And he talks about the differences between histories that are erased and histories that are not yet visible. So it's not that like the LGBTQ history of Buffalo is completely erased, that it doesn't exist. It just hasn't been made visible in the sense that we haven't incorporated it into the broader narrative of LGBTQ history. And of course, LGBTQ history itself is not often included in the macro narrative, the big narrative of American history. So with that said, let's go to the first site on our tour for this evening, which is 69 Johnson Park. Or I like to call it the gayest house in Buffalo. So 69 Johnson Park is an exquisite Victorian house that's located in downtown Buffalo, just south of the Allentown neighborhood. And it's an example of Second Empire architecture. And it's significant to Buffalo history because it's part of the West Village National Register Historic District. However, this house is noteworthy for more than its Victorian era architecture. It's just one of the many places in Western New York that's significant to the LGBTQ history of our region. And I do want to emphasize there's 5 sites on this tour. It's not like this is the be all and end all, right, of LGBTQ sites in Western New York. There's so many more. And so if we could go to then the next photo, thank you. So 69 Johnson Park, it's a 2 1/2 story Second Empire style brick residence. And so representative of that style, it has round arch windows that are topped with decorative keystones, dentiled and bracketed overhanging eaves. So dentiles are like decorative square tooth-like brackets, molded cornices or ornamental moldings, and it's topped with a Mansard roof. That's the name for this style of roof that has both dormer and porthole windows. And the main entry is accented by a one-story wraparound porch that's supported by square columns and an open rail of square balusters. So the Second Empire style was popular in the United States from 1855 to 1885. And it was contemporaneous to the equally popular architectural styles of Italianate and Gothic revival. And so whereas the latter two styles look to the past for inspiration, Second Empire was considered really modern because it was drawing from new and fashionable French architecture. And the name Second Empire actually referred to the reign of Napoleon III, which was known as the Second French Empire. So Italianate and Second Empire styles are quite similar and they draw from similar influences. However, the differentiating character of Second Empire is the Mansard roof, which is essentially a dual pitched hip roof. Or another way that we can think about this is that Second Empire is like an Italianate style building with like a fancy top hat on top of it, and we can clearly see that.
We have to credit LaLouche Mitchell,
Yes.
and a preservation architect from Film Battaglia. He made that up, and I've stolen that and told to lots of people. But yes, it's the best phrase ever.
So 69 Johnson was built circa 1855 by Alonzo Turner, who is a prominent lawyer and real estate investor in Buffalo. And the original address of the residence was 17 Park Place. The longest owners and occupants were a family by the name of Shamat, who took up residence in 1866. And the patriarch of the family, Christopher P. Shamat, was a cobbler who manufactured ladies' and men's theatrical boots and shoes. And he and his wife emigrated to Buffalo from their native France. So after the elder Shamats pass away, their daughters are the owners of 69 Johnson Park, and they may have taken on boarders as a way to help pay for the property. But after their death, the property is converted into a rooming house, and it functions that way until the late 1970s, when it's rehabbed back into a single family home by then owner Donald G. Lee. And in December of 1983, Lee sells the property to Dr. James D. Haynes. If we could go to the next slide. So there's Dr. Jim Haynes, along with his partner, Donald A. Licht, and they return the house to its 19th century splendor, both inside and out. If we could go to the next slide, which shows this is the interior of the house, just incredible. And I had the opportunity to see the inside of the house shortly before Don Licht sold it, and it was just it was like a museum. It was incredibly beautiful. And so not only were Hayes and Licht self-taught preservationists, but they're two of Buffalo's most prominent gay rights activists. So Haynes was originally from Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and he completed a doctorate in biology from Iowa State. He comes to Buffalo in 1967, when he's hired as a professor at Buffalo State College. And that same year, he meets Licht, who is then an anthropology student at the University at Buffalo. They meet at a short-lived gay bar that was on Niagara Street called T&T's Western Paradise. If we can go to the next slide. Licht recalls, this is a quote from him, the beginning of their relationship as follows. So Jim got his PhD from Iowa State in 1967 and interviewed at 10 different institutions, including State University College at Buffalo, and he was hired in 1967. We met, as he likes to say, when we had done his laundry and stopped at the Western Paradise, which was on Niagara Street, and that's where we met. In May of 1967, we got together. At that time, Captain Kennedy of the Vice Squad closed all the gay bars in the city, and there was basically no place for gays to meet. And for a 2-year period, nobody knew what to do. And 69 was the Stonewall Riots in New York City. After the Stonewall Riot, several people brought Frank Kamani, prominent gay rights activist at the time, we'll factor in later in our tour, to Buffalo. And at the end of December, there was a meeting in which Frank Kamani spoke and told people how to organize and get started. And then in January of 1970, there was the second meeting of that group. And we heard about it, and I insisted that we go to the meeting. Jim already had tenure in the biology department, so he was pretty sure they couldn't get rid of him if any information got out. So in the late 1960s, the pair helped to found the Madeline Society of the Niagara Frontier, which is Buffalo's first gay and lesbian civil rights organization. If we could go to the next slide. So this is a photograph of the original Madeline Society, which was founded in Los Angeles in 1950. And the name then becomes synonymous with early gay rights groups. And early gay rights pioneer, Harry Hay, who's featured on the left here, chose the name Mattachine because his research indicated that the Mattachine were this like French fraternal organization that conveyed vital information to oppressed people in the French countryside. So he wanted to create a similar organization that brought knowledge to oppressed American homosexuals. And it's the first gay organization of its kind to have longevity in the US. So then if we can go to the next slide. So this is a reunion photo of members of Mattachine in Buffalo. So Jim Haynes was the first chair of Mattachine's health committee and worked aside LIC to bring a peer counselor training program and hotline to Buffalo that was adopted by other gay and lesbian organizations across the country. LIC served Mattachine in several capacities over the organization's lifetime. He was the vice president, treasurer, chair of social planning, and the pair was also members of the Mattachine Speakers Bureau, and they spoke to audiences throughout Western New York about gay and lesbian civil rights issues. In the 1980s, Haynes begins to study the HIV/AIDS pandemic and helps to co-found Western New York AIDS program, which is today Evergreen Health Services. And along with Don Licht, Mark Bozer, Tom Hammond, and Bob Uplinger, he helps to co-found Gay and Lesbian Youth of Buffalo, which is now Gay and Lesbian Youth Services of Western New York, which is, or GLIS. So Mattachine ceases to function in 1984, and then the couple becomes active in the Buffalo Gay and Lesbian Community Network. If we could go to the next slide. That shows members of the community network, which is co-founded by Carol Spesser, who's in the yellow t-shirt, and Larry Peck, who's wearing the very nice pink pants here. So in addition to their activism, Haynes and Licht were also known for hosting period authentic Victorian holiday parties at their house, where they had a real evergreen tree that was decorated with lit candles. And a funny story here, their papers are in the Madeline Davis archive, and there is a file that says, it's labeled something like Jim and Don personal photographs. And I thought, oh, it's going to be like pictures of them as a couple. And it was all pictures of their Christmas tree. None of them. So not only did this pair work tirelessly to preserve 69 Johnson Park, but also the LGBTQ history of Buffalo. In 2001, they helped to found the Madeline Davis GLBT Archives of Western New York, which are now located at Buff State. Haynes passed away on November 9th of 2008. Lick remains in Buffalo, and he sold their home of nearly 4 decades in 2019. But this stunning Victorian residence remains as a reminder of both Buffalo's former glory and also our unacknowledged LGBTQ history. Okay, so are there any questions before we move on to our next site?
No, there have not been any questions. And
okay.
Have them as they pop up, people. Just type away into the chat box.
Okay, so we are going to jump to 9500 Clarence Center Road in Clarence, New York. And this is the great thing about a virtual tour. We can go from Buffalo to Clarence. So this home is located in Clarence Center, which is a hamlet of the town of Clarence. So Clarence was established in March 11th of 1808, and it's actually the first township in Erie County. And over its life, it progresses from a heavily forested rural town to the suburb it is today. So 9500 Clarence Center Road, which is built circa 1835, is a classic and well-preserved example of Greek Revival architecture. But it also holds an important place in Western New York's transgender history. So if we could go to the next slide, which is the map. So on this map, we can see that the property is located on the northeast corner of Clarence Center Road and Railroad Street. And then if we go to the next slide, it's a two-story cross-gabled Greek Revival style residence. It has a stone-cut foundation, wood clapboard siding and shingles, frieze band windows, which are little windows that are inset in that band of trim around the roof. Corner pilasters, which are like the engaged columns that you could see at the corners of the house. And the residence is divided into 3 different building campaigns or sections. So there's a main block that faces Railroad Street and features the residence's primary entry and also the prominent gable wall chimney. There's a second block that's the rear ring to the main block that features a 1-story full length with porch that faces Clarence Center Road. And then there's a third block that's a 1-story rear addition to the secondary block. And you can't see it in the photograph, but there's also a large barn. It's an original barn that remains at the back of the property. And this barn is significant to the story that's connected to this particular home. So Greek Revival as a style was popular in the United States from 1825 to 1860. And so dominant was this style that at the time, it wasn't referred to as Greek Revival, it was just called the National style. It originates in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with buildings such as the Bank of America. And around the 1830s, it gains prominence within domestic architecture. On October 19th of 1954, 9500 Clarence Center Road was purchased by Peggy Ames and her then wife, Gladys L. Dietrich, from Roy Wilson, who was a local Clarence accident and health insurance agent, and also his wife, Betty Wilson. So if we could go to the next slide. Peggy and Gladys, however, were not a lesbian couple. And at the time, Peggy was not publicly out as her true self. Born in 1921 in Buffalo, Ames was identified as male at birth, but beginning around the age of 12, she sensed that she was different. She dresses in her mother's clothes, and she borrows her mother's and her sister's cosmetics when she's alone. She enrolls in Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, and joins a fraternity, tries to fit in with her male peers. It's also here that she meets Gladys. After college, the pair marries and they have a child, David, before Ames is drafted into the Air Force in World War II. Honorably discharged a year later, she completes dual degrees at the University at Buffalo and opens an insurance business with Gladys and has 3 more children. So the Dietrich family seems like they're a model family. They have an excellent reputation in Clarence. They're very involved in their community, but Ames was living a dual existence. When she would travel for business trips, she outwardly presented as the man everyone assumed that she was. but she was Peggy the remainder of the time. And she followed the story of Christine Jorgensen. If we could go to the next slide. And so Christine Jorgensen was the first transgender celebrity who brought the concept of sex change to the forefront of American consciousness in the media. But though Ames admired Jorgensen, her story also made her nervous because she saw that a lot of people saw her as little more than a freak. And her suspicion was that, in Cold War America, people were not going to be supportive of a public declaration of her identity. And it's not even until 1963 that she hears the word transsexual for the first time. Oh, and if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So this was the news story that kind of introduces Christine Jorgensen to the American public from the New York Daily News. XGI becomes blonde beauty. Operations transform Bronx youth. So Ames realizes, right, this word transsexual that describes who she is. And this is in 1973. And that same year, she's discovered as her true self by Gladys. She is dressed as Peggy, and Gladys returns home, right, and finds Peggy not the husband she thinks that she knows. And they end up divorcing. Originally, they were going to live together, but the sticking point was that not only was Peggy trans, she also identified as a lesbian, and Gladys was very religious, and that was, too much for her. So she says they can't, live together as friends. And so the deal is that Peggy gets the house and Gladys gets their joint insurance business. So the deed is transferred into Peggy's legal name in 1973. And as a result of losing the family business, and she's also rejected by the community, she struggles financially for the remainder of her life. And to support herself, she opens a furniture refinishing business and antique business that was called Pine Crafts, Pyne, that she operated out of that barn that's located at the back of the property. And so she's essentially working as a woodworker. And just a funny aside here, when I was going through Peggy's papers at the Davis archive, there's a whole file in her papers that it's labeled woodworking. Now, woodworking was also a term that trans women of Peggy's generation used for what today we would refer to as passing, or like blending into the woodwork of mainstream society, which is actually what medical professionals recommended at the time, right? Leave your old life behind, forget who you were, blend in, become a new person. So I thought, oh, how interesting that she kept a whole file of materials about woodworking or passing. And so I open up the file, and the first document that's in the file is an essay that she wrote that's called The History of the Chair. And I just had like a moment where my brain didn't register, and I was like, what? The history of the chair? And I was like, okay, so we're talking about like literal woodworking, not woodworking in the transgender sense. So I thought I would make fun of myself a bit
I think that's funny.
there. Thank you.
But also I'd like to know more about her theories of the chair and her, what other drawings were in there.
I mean, I think, and we can see her interest in woodworking in terms of how well she maintained this house. So as I said, she's struggling financially, but she does press forward with medically transitioning. She has sex reassignment surgery in New York City in 1974. And she realizes that staying quiet or closeted about her identity is not going to advance acceptance in Western New York. So she joins the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier. and is actually elected secretary in 1973 and 1974. She participates in the peer counselor training program, which I already mentioned, organizes panels on transsexualism for Buffalo's Gay Pride Week, joins the Speakers Bureau, and in 1978, the Buffalo Courier Express, the now defunct newspaper, ran a profile of Ames, and she estimated that at that time she had lectured to around 12,000 people in Western New York on the topic of transsexualism. And she often began her lectures by throwing a bag of rocks on the table to get the audience's attention and illustrate the type of harassment that she faced just for being who she was. Because broken glass was a frequent occurrence at her house. Boys from Clarence Center would often run by screaming obscenities, and they further expressed their intolerance by hurling rocks through her windows. And this is a portrait of, or a photograph of Peggy, posing at her in her home. And if we could go to the next slide. Her advocacy also had national reach. She was an established contact person for the Erickson Educational Foundation, and later when the EEF folds in 1977, the Janus Information Facility, which is based out of the University of Texas in Galveston. So the EEF was established in 1964 by the independently wealthy transgender man, Reed Erickson, who's featured here. And the organization becomes the leading organization to fund research into transsexualism and to provide information and support to trans people in need. And so the EEF financed three primary ventures. One Incorporated, which is an early gay rights organization in Los Angeles. Also New Age spiritual ventures. So Reed Erickson actually finances the publication of the New Age spiritual text, A Course in Miracles, and then research into transsexualism. And if we could go to the next slide. So he was the financer, but the individual who ran and managed the day-to-day operations of the EEF was a woman by the name of Zelda R. Suppley. And if we look at Peggy's papers in the Davis archive, there's correspondence between her and Zelda Suppley. Interestingly, Zelda Suppley was also a practicing nudist or naturalist before she ran the EEF. She managed a nudist colony in Florida. And she was also the first full frontal nude centerfold in Playboy magazine in black and white. So quite the interesting woman. And so the way that it worked is with Peggy being an established contact person was that when people would contact the EEF looking for support and they were from the Western New York area, they were often referred to her for peer counseling or transition related guidance. And in fact, we can see from the correspondence between Peggy and Zelda Suppley, at one point, she's running an EEF registered informal counseling service out of her house and also is providing shelter for trans women in need of temporary living accommodation. So she wouldn't have been able to do this advocacy, have this national reach, be involved with the EEF if she didn't have this house as a base of operations. It allows her to continue her advocacy and also support herself because she's running the business out of the barn as well. But despite Ames's advocacy, she is rejected by some members of Buffalo's lesbian community. Oh, and if we could go to the next slide. I forgot to mention this. The EEF wrote and distributed a lot of influential pamphlet. So for example, this is a 1974 guidelines for transsexuals. So really providing, some of the services that today's modern LGBTQ centers are providing. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. She was actually kicked out of two Buffalo lesbian organizations, GROW, Gay Rights for Older Women, and also Sisters of Sappho. But I think it's important for us to place the way that some lesbians reacted to her in context, keeping in mind that many women at this time had few experiences interacting with transsexual women, didn't know much about trans issues in general, and that I think we forget how different things were for women in the 1960s and 70s, that many of these women are coming into their own, finding their voices, and they may have been influenced by the perspectives of other prominent feminists, such as someone like Robin Morgan, who's featured here at a protest of the Miss America pageant, and she's throwing her bra away in a trash can that they had, where they were throwing away implements of female oppression, like bras and girdles and makeup and fashion magazines. And right, this is significant because like one of the things that Robin Morgan accuses trans women of is that they're not real women. They're kind of parodying womanhood by wearing things that are feminine, or like having long hair or makeup. And she actually expressed this viewpoint when she was the keynote speaker at the West Coast Lesbian Feminist Conference in 1973, which was the largest lesbian feminist conference in the US up until that point. And if we go to the next slide, in particular, she takes issue with the presence at that conference of Beth Elliott, who's a transsexual lesbian feminist and folk singer, and she wants Beth Elliott to be expelled from that conference. And she actually refers to her as an opportunist, an infiltrator, and a destroyer, right? She's not a real woman, but she's infiltrating and trying to destroy the women's movement from the inside out. And if we can go to the next slide. So Robin Morgan also edits this very influential anthology, Sisterhood is Powerful, which is the first widely available anthology of second wave feminist writing. It often appeared on women's studies syllabi. And if we look at, especially women's studies syllabi from Women's Studies College at the University of Buffalo, this was a text that was frequently assigned, right? So we have to keep in mind that how emerging young feminists might have been influenced by the perspectives that someone like a Robin Morgan held about trans women. Ames mostly withdraws from public advocacy after the early 1980s, but she continues to educate and provide support through peer counseling and correspondence. The deed is actually put under her real name, Peggy Ames, in 1984, when due to financial trouble, she has to refinance her mortgage. And though she contemplates leaving and selling many times, she never did actually leave her historic Greek Revival house, despite some of the mistreatment that she faced. And if we could go on to the next slide. This is a quote from, so this is a picture from that profile I mentioned from Buffalo Courier Express. And then this is also a quote from her personal papers. Actually, this is from her unpublished autobiography that she was writing. And in this quote, she expresses how her house essentially comes to represent an extension of her personality and identity. Now this home represents an extension of me, my personality and my work. Folks who visit near immediately react to these forces. They often exclaim how warm, hospitable, and much like me, my interests and the comfortableness the entire house projects. It loses its house-like character and becomes a part of the occupant. So Peggy Ames passed away in 2000 at the age of 79. And she left her estate to her longtime friends, none other than Jim Haynes and Don Licht, who sold the property to its current owner in 2001. She dealt with many hardships, but I think it's important that we don't see her as solely a victim, because she wasn't. And through her stubborn persistence, she really paved the way for future generations of trans and gender nonconforming people in Western New York, but also beyond. And one of the things that I've argued in my work is that she is not just a participant in this emerging transgender rights movement, but I actually see her as one of the mothers of this movement, who just hasn't been acknowledged because, again, she is working out of a rural community. She's not in a big city. Okay, do we have, oh, sorry about that, questions before we move on?
No questions, but just everyone did enjoy your story of the woodworking. And
Good.
brava, Peggy, what a pioneer and hero.
Excellent.
Yeah. On to the next.
Okay. So our next stop on the tour is 510 Tacoma Avenue in Buffalo, New York. And so this site is really an example of a property that might not, be the most architecturally interesting, but has a really important individual and story connected to it. So 510 Tacoma is located in North Buffalo between Norwalk and Sterling Avenues. It was built in 1922 by Benjamin B. Lee, who's a prominent Buffalo contractor. And the house is an example of a traditional Buffalo double, or a two-flat residence that also has some influences of prairie architectural style. And so 510 Tacoma was briefly home to one of Buffalo's most well-known LGBTQ writers and activists, none other than Leslie Feinberg. So the Buffalo double houses are an example of vernacular style. So it's a standard type of housing that was used by ordinary workers. So most two-floor or two-flat Buffalo homes were built during the city's industrial prime, so between roughly 1890 and 1929. And the double house represents a step up from apartment buildings for workers, as families were often able to live in one flat, rent the other one, and use that rent to pay their mortgages. Many of the double houses in North Buffalo, particularly in the Hurdle and North Park areas, were constructed by Jewish builders and realtors beginning in the 1920s. And of course, the Feinbergs are a Jewish family. So 510 is representative of a double with prairie influences. So it has a low-pitched hip roof, a hip roof dormer, so that window that's coming out of the roof, and an asymmetrical door. And so prairie style originates in Chicago, and most prairie style suburban homes are built between 1905 and 1915. So with 510 Tacoma, a building permit was issued to Benjamin B. Lee on March 8th of 1922 by the Buffalo Common Council. And while he may have constructed this house based on a pattern, it's also equally plausible that it was designed by his daughter, Ethel Lee McBain, who is a prominent architect in Buffalo. And she was best known for designing the Paul Revere House, which is a colonial style house that's located in the Cleveland Hill neighborhood. But Irving D. Feinberg and his wife, Vance Hyde, purchased 510 Tacoma on September 25th of 1962. And their acquisition of the property is representative of the upward mobility of Jewish Buffalonians that we see at the time. And between the 1950s and 70s, the Hurdle and North Park areas develop rapidly and become the center of Buffalo's working class Jewish community. And right, in fact, the reason why the Feinbergs buy this double is, again, so that they can live in one half and rent the other half to help pay their mortgage. So Vance Hyde, Leslie's mother, was originally from Silver Spring, Maryland, and she attends the Pennsylvania College for Women. And after graduation, moves to Washington, D.C., where she meets Buffalo native Irving Feinberg, who's completing his degree at George Washington University. They marry in August of 1948 and relocate to Lockport. Leslie's their first child, who's born in 1949, Christine in 1951, and then Linda in 1955. And as the family expands, Irving takes a position as an office supervisor at the Sylvania Electric Company. And I do want to note here, those of you that are familiar with Leslie Feinberg will know that throughout the course of her life, she used a variety of different pronouns, both she and her, and then gender inclusive pronouns like Zer. But I'm going to use she, her for Leslie because every one that I've talked to and interviewed that knew Leslie personally used she, her for her. So I'm going to defer to that pronoun set. So the Feinbergs are a really artistic family. Irving is a musician. And Vance actually studied creative writing in college, and she writes 2 books. One was a manual for how to raise daughters that was called "And Everything Nice," after the adage that girls should be sugar and spice and everything nice. And another book called "Especially for Mother" that was an inspirational anthology, essentially, for women who were mothers. So we go to the next slide. So here was an article that was written about her. 58 Mrs. Buffalo, I'll explain that just in just a minute, writes 2 books. So we can see, Linda, Leslie, and Christine. And I found this really fascinating that Leslie's mother was a published author because they have a lot of conflict later about Leslie's gender nonconformity, but Vance is not the typical 1950s Buffalo housewife, despite the fact that she presents herself as such, right? The average wife and mother at the time is not, writing books, doing interviews, getting featured in the press. And in 1958, if we could go to the next slide, she was also crowned Mrs. Buffalo, which was a local division of the National Mrs. America contest. And so this was a pageant for Buffalonian housewives that judged contestants on their cooking, homemaking abilities, poise, and personality. And I think we could definitely see the resemblance between Vance Hyde and Leslie in this photograph from the Buffalo Courier Express. So the Feinberg siblings attend Bennett High School, and Christine and Linda thrive, but Leslie struggles. And it was difficult for her growing up as a differently gendered person in blue-collar Buffalo in the 1950s. She originally identifies as a butch lesbian, is harassed for simply walking down the street. Her family is not particularly accepting, and as a result, she drops out of school at the age of 14 and has to work various low-wage jobs to support herself. And so this is the house, 510 Tacoma, that the family was living in when she leaves at the age of 14. And if you've read Feinberg's semi-autobiographical novel, Stone Butch Blues, you know that the character that is based on her, Jess Goldberg, also leaves home at the age of 14 as well. So we see, parallel in this house featuring in her novel as well. And so then she enters Buffalo's gay social scene, which at the time is centered around bar culture, and is a space of both community and a source of fear because of the harassment that gay and gender nonconforming Buffalonians face at the hands of the Buffalo Police Department, which we've already talked about a bit with the beginnings of Mattachine. And these experiences formed the background for her most well-known work, her novel Stonebutch Blues, which I already mentioned. If we could go to the next slide, the portrait of Leslie. And she comes to define herself as transgender. And I want to include this quote because the way she saw herself, right, is a bit different from, I think, how we would define transgender at this moment. So she said, I am transgendered. I was born female, but my masculine gender expression is seen as male. It's not my sex that defines me, and it's not my gender expression. It's the fact that my gender expression appears to be at odds with my sex. And if we could go to the next slide.
Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Somebody was interested in the usage of Z and Zer, and at what time period did Leslie use that? And was this one of the earliest examples of using that terminology? Because the person asking the question felt that it was a much more recent thing.
Yeah, 1990s, because Leslie and then other trans activists in the 90s that she actually does a lot of work with, like Kate Bornstein and Ricky Wilkins, really start helping to bring transgender identities and this term to the forefront of American consciousness, and to help, and they were kind of defining it at the time as kind of anyone who exists outside of gender norms or our Western gender binary. So in order to help to shift the culture, the consciousness, the way that we're thinking about gender, a lot of transgender activists in the 1990s are developing new pronoun sets, right? Because then shift in language that allows us to think about the nature of gender in a different way. Were there any other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
But Jeff, thank you for sharing that. Yes, Stonebutch Blues can be read online in its entirety.
Yeah, so you just go to Leslie Feinberg's website. It's free and available as a PDF. And this is a quote from Feinberg's cover letter that she wrote to Firebrand Press, a small lesbian feminist publisher based in Ithaca, New York, that was the first publisher of Stonebutch Blues. And this is actually the photograph of Leslie that appears on the cover of the book. And in her cover letter, she explains that the book is very much based, growing up in Buffalo as a working class Jewish lesbian. And so, right, directly kind of connecting this significant literary work to her experience growing up in Buffalo, right, which overlaps with her time at 510 Tacoma. And if we could go to the next slide. And she came back to Buffalo for the release of the book. This is a flyer from the book launch event, which was held at the Ascension Church on Linwood. Okay, and so at this particular moment in our history, it would be amiss of me not to mention the fact that Feinberg was also very involved in anti-racist activism and work. And in particular, she was a leader of the Workers' World Party, an independent Marxist-Leninist party. And as part of her work with WWP, she organized or co-founded this initiative called Rainbow Flags for Mumia, which was a coalition of LGBTQ organizers who marched in support of a new trial for death row inmate Mumia Abu Jamal, who in 1981 had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for allegedly shooting a police officer in Philadelphia. And of course, he has maintained his innocence and said that his arrest was a result of racial profiling. Around 2007, Feinberg starts to have health issues, and she's diagnosed with late stage Lyme disease. And part of the reason why her illness goes so long undiagnosed was that medical professionals would often refuse to see her, would turn her away because of her gender nonconformity. She passed away on November 15th of 2014 from complications due to Lyme disease. However, as my friend Camille Hopkins, local transgender activist, explained to me, and I agree with her, she said, Lyme disease did not kill Leslie Feinberg, transphobia killed Leslie Feinberg. So 510 Tacoma was not a happy place for young Leslie, but it was a formative place, as were the factories that she worked in Buffalo and the bars where she socialized. But it was, the place where she started to become who she was, and it's where she found community. So although, this is a story of struggle that's connected to a particular site, it gives us insight into the making of someone who became an internationally known and renowned transgender activist. Okay, questions before we move on to our fourth site?
Yes, a question just came in asking about Peggy, kind of going back. Did Peggy have contact with Tangaera? I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm saying that right, or other members of the drag community, or did these communities remain rather separate at the time?
Great question. So yeah, Tangaera, early drag female impersonator in Buffalo. Real name was John Minzer. So in terms of the, the existing sources that exist in the Davis archive, there's nothing that I came across that specifically connects them, but their paths may have crossed because I do know that when Peggy was starting to explore her trans identity, she was actually going to like drag shows and strip shows, essentially, as a way to like study female anatomy and how to dress and present as a woman. So it's quite possible that their paths cross, but I can't say for sure.
Excellent. Those are all our questions right now.
Okay, so we will go to the next slide and our fourth site, 330 Franklin Street. 330 Franklin Street was formerly located on the southwest corner of Franklin and West Tupper Streets at the southern edge of the historic Allentown neighborhood. And this building is an example of Federal style, which is a colonial type of architecture. And the building housed both the addresses 330 and 332 Franklin. 330 is the section of the building on the left with the awning. So the building was constructed of brick and representative of the Federal style. It has a low-pitched hip roof, molded cornices that are emphasized by decorative brackets, and a step-gabled wall. So those like funny brick things that are extending on either side. And Federal buildings are particularly characterized by their symmetrical fenestration pattern, which is fenestration refers to the alignment of the windows. So they're aligned in horizontal and vertical rows. And, as with 330 Franklin, typically these windows are 5 flank, or there's 5 rows on the building's front facade. Federal was the dominant architectural style of the United States from between 1780 and 1920. And it's most popular in Buffalo between 1790 and 1830. We haven't been able to confirm the exact construction date of 330 and 332 Franklin, but we do know that the building was completed by 1854. It can be found on the Quackenboss and Kennedy map of the city, and it's identified as a second-class brick dwelling and part store. So over its lifetime, the lower floor housed a variety of different businesses. So we can see here in the photograph, the Tutton Battery Service. It was also a restaurant called the Tiki, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And if we go to the next slide, here's a picture of the intersection of Franklin and West Tupper. We could also see it was the Radio Doctor. And then on the left-hand side of the street, this was an apartment building that was called the Bachelor. It's no longer there, but it was one of the first apartment houses in Buffalo built explicitly for that purpose. And it was for a single gentleman. And then if we look at the very left-hand side of the photograph, the building that's cut off is still there. And most recently, it was the bar Buffalo proper. At the time, it was a bar called Lachlan's. So in 1968, James F. Garrow opens the Tiki Restaurant at 330 Franklin. Garrow was originally from Tampa, Florida, and his business played a foundational role in the beginnings of a movement for gay and lesbian civil rights in Buffalo. The Tiki opens at a time in Buffalo's history that I've already mentioned, where gay bars were being routinely targeted by the Buffalo Police Department Bureau of Vice Enforcement, and few existed for an extended period of time. And this closure of gay bars accelerated when a man by the name of Kenneth P. Kennedy becomes captain of the BVE in 1967. He's a devout Irish Catholic, and he saw homosexuality as being both criminal and amoral, and really used the authority of his position to establish Buffalo's gay community. Now, the Tiki wasn't a bar, and this was because Garrow was unable to obtain a liquor license due to his prior criminal convictions, some related to homosexuality. And when I say, criminal convictions related to homosexuality, primarily I'm talking about like solicitation here. So the Tiki didn't serve alcohol, but it became a popular space for gay Buffalonians in the late 1960s. Jim Garrow had a girlfriend for public pretenses, but everyone knew he was gay. And people have described him to me as being this like big burly guy with a big affable personality. He was in his late 1940s or his late 40s. People really liked him. They wanted to go to his establishment. And among his patrons were a newly out lesbian named Merni Kern and her then girlfriend, Leslie Feinberg. And Kern, when I interviewed her, had really vivid memories of Garrow and the Tiki. And if we go to the next slide, it's a quote from her. And I'm going to read this in full because it's great. We had a period of time where there were no bars. Then that is when all of a sudden the Tiki Club showed up. And I don't remember how I heard about it, but we have quite a network or whatever. So the Tiki was on Franklin and Tupper. They had 2 rooms and they both had tables. Jim would, it was just a coffee house. There was no booze. Make a turkey every day. So he started getting a lunch bunch every day from downtown. He would either have a hot roast with bread and gravy or cold turkey sandwiches, and he would serve that until he ran out of turkey, and that was it. So there was many a night I went down there for dinner at around 5, 6 o'clock and had turkey, and that was it. He only made turkey. That was the only thing on his menu. And he made damn good coffee. And once in a while, he would have a folk singer come in. We weren't real happy about that. There were straight people who would come in for that. If you didn't have a folk singer, it would be a Friday or Saturday night with the jukebox, and we would be dancing all the time. I'm pretty sure that the place was open like 24 hours a day. As a matter of fact, I remember drinking coffee there all night and then going to work. I got to work and I remember telling everybody that I hadn't slept all night, and it was like, wow, if you drink enough coffee, you never have to waste time sleeping. You can stay out all night and party as long as you get enough coffee. Yeah, try that 2 nights in a row and you start falling asleep at work standing up. It was not a good idea. So if we go to the next slide, Merni Kern mentions folk singers performed at the Tiki, and one of those folk singers was Madeline Davis. How could we not mention Madeline on this tour, because we couldn't have this tour without the archive that she assembled. And in a letter that Madeline wrote to Maxine Feldman in 1982, Maxine Feldman was a lesbian singer-songwriter. And this letter is in her archive. She explains, or she talks about performing at the Tiki. But before this quote, she's talking about how, you know, she had some relationships with men, but then she had relationships with women, and she decided, you know, that was much better. So she says, I woke up one morning and found myself queer, and I loved it. My music didn't start to change significantly, however, until the late 60s. I began changing pronouns, making coffee house owners quite nervous. I was developing a dyke following, and I could tell as they looked out of their little kitchens, the owners weren't quite sure what was happening. I also recall singing at a restaurant/coffee house called the Tiki Club. Much of my audience by this time was gay, and although I didn't sing gay songs, were there any? I talked gay, and no other public performers around town were doing that. There weren't any other gay performers to our knowledge. And so if we could go to the next slide, I think this quote from Madeline and the fact that she performed at the Tiki is really significant, because it explains in part why when she gets involved in the gay liberation movement in Buffalo, she essentially becomes the local face of that movement and the spokesperson for the community, because she was out as a performer, right? People knew her. She was someone who was visibly lesbian in the community, and right, that's why she goes on to become an early and influential member of the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier. In 1971, she speaks at the March on Albany for gay rights, and in 1972, Mattachine runs her as a delegate for George McGovern. And she speaks at the Democratic National Convention in July of 1972, along with Jim Foster from San Francisco. And they're the first people to ever present a gay rights plank at the DNC. And so her being a performer who is known in the community was really significant. And she also points out that, you know, there was no gay music when she started her career as a performer. And so she had to get creative and sing songs that weren't necessarily gay songs and give them a different resonance. And one of the songs that she would sing that was originally released in 1969 by Roberta Flack, it was called Ballad of the Sad Young Men. Now, it's quite possible that Madeline performed this song at the Tiki, and she would often dedicate it to her gay brothers, or the gay men she knew. And we can see how the lyrics of this song, though not what Roberta Flack intended, really take on a different resonance if we're thinking about it in the context, you know, of gay men at this time in Buffalo, right? Thinking about, you know, sad young men sitting in a bar, kissing their dreams goodbye. And so I actually have a recording of Madeline singing the song that was shared with me by Bruce Greenberg and Richard McGinnis, who were early and influential members of the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier. I think they might be here, so if you're here, thanks guys. So we're going to listen to it, and it was converted from a tape from the early 70s. So I recommend that you turn the volume on your devices up. So let's imagine it's 1969. We're at the Tiki and we're listening to Madeline Davis perform.
Back. Oh no.
Uh-oh.
And we even practice this.
A lot of people. Sing a song of sad young men, glasses full of pride. All the news is bad again. Kiss your dreams goodbye. All the sad young men sitting in the bars, knowing neon lights, missing all the stars. All the sad young men whistling through the town, drinking up the nights, trying not to drown. All the sad young men singing in the cold, trying to forget that they're growing old. All the sad young men choking on their youth. Let your gentle light guide them home again. All the sad young men.
Is that her playing guitar in it?
Yeah, she is. Yeah. And so that was actually recorded at a concert that she gave at the Unitarian Church on Elmwood. And I should also say that the photograph of her here, unfortunately, is not her at the Tiki. I don't think, that exists, unfortunately. But Madeline told me that this photograph was from what she performed at, I believe, a gay picnic in Pennsylvania in 1973. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. And one of the things that Jim Garrow was frequently talking about to his customers who came in, so people like Merni Kern and Leslie Feinberg, was stories about the Jewel Box Review from his days in Tampa, Florida. And founded in Miami in 1939 by the entrepreneurs Doc Brenner and Danny Brown, the Jewel Box Review was a variety show similar to the vaudeville era. However, they structured their show around the art of female impersonation. And the review primarily featured gay men who were performing and presenting themselves as women, with the lone exception of the Black lesbian drag queen, Stormy DeLarvery, who you may have heard of because she participates in the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. So beginning in the 1940s, the Jewel Box Review becomes highly successful. It tours the country for over 3 decades. It has a racially integrated cast. one of the things that scholars have said about the Jewel Box Review was it was an important way that gay people were forming community and carving out a space for themselves before the gay liberation movement in the late 1960s. So I interpret Jim Garrow's nostalgia that he had for the Jewel Box Review as an indication of his desire to create like a similar community space in blue collar Buffalo. And I was in fact able to confirm by looking at newspapers from Tampa, from when Jim Garrow would have lived there, that the Jewel Box Review did indeed perform in Tampa multiple times. So that was his his inspiration for wanting to create a space for gay people. But the context in New York State at the time made it really difficult for him to do so. And if we can go to the next slide. In addition to Captain Kennedy from the BVE and his campaign, one of the other things that we see happening in New York State is Governor Nelson Rockefeller, or Rocky as he was known, institutes an anti-vice campaign in New York State. And this is because of a New York State law that's called the Moreland Act that allows the governor of the state to impanel a commission to investigate particular issues. And so the Moreland Act panel that Rocky forms to investigate the state liquor authority reveals widespread corruption within the state's distribution and sale of alcohol. So as a result, businesses that sell liquor, particularly bars, come under increased scrutiny. So this was not specifically, right, an anti-gay measure, but it has a negative effect on gay bars because of the increased scrutiny. So what Garrow really wants to do is both obtain a liquor license for his establishment, but also to create a community space for gay people. And in the fall of 1969, he closes 330 Franklin and rents a rundown 3-story building that was located at 70 Delaware Avenue, just off of Niagara Square. If we could go to the next slide, which is a map that so we can see in the center, we're looking at Delaware Avenue, and then we could see where 70 Delaware was on the map. It's no longer there. It's been replaced by the Sedita Court building. 70 Delaware had been formerly a straight restaurant and bar that was called the Avenue Grill. But essentially what Garrow does is quite clever. Oh, and if we go to the next slide, this is the best photograph I could find that shows that building. But so we can see in the foreground here, and we're looking down Delaware Avenue off of Niagara Square. So that big building is the Women's Industrial Union. And then next to it, we see like the carriage house, and then the space in between the two buildings, which was called the Guthrie Alley. It's no longer there. And then the building to the left of the alley in the photograph was 70 Delaware. So that's the building that he purchases. And essentially what he does is he argues that this is his private residence. So there's no reason that he can't open the ground floor as a private club for his gay and lesbian friends who want a place to socialize and cut loose, even though sometimes he's making them pay a cover charge. Of course, the Buffalo Police Department catches wind of this and they're not too happy, and they put the building under surveillance. And this is when they recognize that more drastic measures are necessary. And if we can go to the next slide. Jim Garrow gets some inspiration when he reads the October 1969 edition of Time magazine, which featured an article called The Homosexual in America. And if we go to the next slide, that article quotes a man by the name of Frank Kamani, who is an early and influential gay rights activist. I like to call him the father of the gay rights movement. He was a former federal government worker for the Army Map Service, which is the precursor to NASA, who is fired from his job as part of the larger purges of gays and lesbians that are occurring in the federal government in the 1950s, right, because of his sexuality. This radicalizes him. He starts a Washington, D.C. branch of the Mattachine Society and starts challenging the federal government directly for gay rights. So Jim Garrow brings him to speak to the Buffalo gay community, and he tells them, get together, write up a constitution, put the constitution in a drawer, and go out and work for gay rights. And then if we go to the next slide, he also talks to them about his early efforts, right, picketing for gay rights, picketing the federal government in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, pointing out the fact that at this time in the 1950s and 60s, gay people have second-class citizenship in the United States. And then if we go to the next slide, he, of course, talks to them about Stonewall. And this is very interesting, right? Because this is the first time that many gay and lesbian Buffalonians might have realized kind of the significance of Stonewall in a more national context, that they were really organizing and getting together, not because they were inspired directly by Stonewall, but because of immediate concerns that were happening in Buffalo. Right? Because normally the narrative is that Stonewall is the beginning of everything, and then it trickles down or disperses through the rest of the country. And Jim Garrow even did an interview with the Advocate, early gay newsletter, started in LA and then was relocated to San Francisco, where he talks about his attempts to start a gay community center in Buffalo and the harassment he was facing. And if we go to the next slide, I think someone has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. When exactly was Kamani in Buffalo?
December of 1969.
Thank you.
And so Garrow's trying to start a community center of sorts. And this is really significant because if that was the case, and I think in fact it is because it was reported in the Advocate, this means that community center, which was functioning in that manner at 70 Delaware for a while, that this was one of the first gay community centers in the country. Normally people will point to, in terms of the first centers in LA, and then also the Gay Activists Alliance Firehouse, which is located at 99 Worcester Street in Soho. It was actually locally landmarked by New York City in 2019. So we can see the facade of the building in the 70s versus 2019, but that center didn't open up, or that space didn't open up until 1971, right? And here we have people trying to establish a similar space in Buffalo almost 2 years earlier in 1969. So if we go to the next slide. And so because of Jim Garrow's attempts to skirt the rules and say, I'm gonna have people in my building anyway, this is my private residence, 70 Delaware is raided several times by the BVE, both in January of 1970 and then April of 1970. And then if we go to the next slide, the individuals that lead those raids are Lieutenant John J. Breen, who's pictured on the left here, and then Captain Kenneth Kennedy, who I've already mentioned. And what they're doing in this photograph is they're inspecting like a still where people are illegally making alcohol. In response to the second raid, if we go to the next slide, in April of 1970, there is actually a group of individuals that picket City Hall for gay rights. And I should point out here that the exact place that they're picketing is where this past summer, peaceful protester Martin Gugino was assaulted by the Buffalo police. And that clip obviously made national news. They were protesting in front of City Hall in that exact spot. And I think that this protest was largely lost to memory, but I was able to find this tiny little article about it from the Buffalo Courier Express that tells us 7 young men picketed in front of City Hall briefly Monday afternoon. So this was a really bold move, right? Even though there were 7 of them, Monday afternoon in Niagara Square, right? There's a lot of people there at the time. There's cars driving around. They really publicly exposed themselves. And after, right, a brutal raid had taken place, right, where people were beaten and some people were taken to the hospital as a result of that raid. When I was giving a talk about these issues a year ago now at Buff State, and I showed this article at the end of my talk, a woman stood up and said, I have a correction to make about your presentation. And I thought, oh no, what did I get wrong? And she said, that article that you showed about the picket, it was actually 6 young men and me. And that woman who stood up and made that correction was Merni Kern. And she was involved in this picket. And she had a more butch appearance at the time. And so the reporter from the Buffalo Courier Express just thought she was a young man. But she was there. She participated. It was 7 young gay men and her. So if we can go to the next slide. So Jim Garrow has a lot of mounting legal trouble, and the emerging organization that's coming out of 70 Delaware, Managing Society of the Niagara Frontier, it starts to distance themselves from him, and they move their base of operations to the Unitarian Church on Elmwood, and then shortly after, 70 Delaware and that whole part of Delaware Avenue is leveled to make room for the Frank A. Sedita Court building. This is a picture from Niagara Square in 1977. That shows the court building. And my SUNY Fredonia people that are here, maybe this building and architectural style looks familiar to you because it was designed by the architect I.M. Pei and his firm Pei, Cobb, Freed, and Partners, who also designed much of the modern SUNY Fredonia campus that was erected between 1968 and 1973. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. So the Managing Society of the Niagara Frontier adopts a constitution, bylaws, and incorporates as a domestic not-for-profit corporation in New York State in June 9th of 1970. Jim Garrow, because of his mounting legal troubles, flees Buffalo and goes back to Tampa, Florida. And I believe he lives there till the end of his life. I was able to find his obituary. He died on October 9th of 1984 at the age of 63. and I can't confirm this for certain, but my hunch as a historian, given the year of his death and his age, is that he was an early victim of HIV AIDS. So though he left Buffalo, his influence and his intention to create a sense of gay community, like that which existed in the Jewel Box Review that he so much admired, remained. So now the community was unified in a common struggle for liberation, but of course there were obstacles that they face specific to the context of Buffalo. Doing gay liberation in a racially divided Catholic industrial city located on the edge of the Midwest. And one of the things that we see happening at this time is the Rust Belt is becoming the Rust Belt. There's plant closures that are sweeping the Great Lakes region. And there's economic and cultural decline, right? And we could see that being talked about, how runaway plants from the Buffalo Workers Movement newsletter in 1978. And if we can go to the next slide, this shows right, a map of the Rust Belt. So right, we're talking about, again, the deindustrialized Great Lakes and Midwestern region. And this deindustrialization happens between 69 and 84. Interestingly, those are the exact years that Mattachine is active as an organization. So 330 Franklin Street, right, to go back to where we started with this stop on the tour, was not immune to the changes that were going on in Buffalo. And by 1980, the building was torn down. So Jim Garrow's Tiki Restaurant survives on the corner of Franklin and West Tupper only for 2 years, but its legacy and the vision of its owner have certainly lived on. Any questions before we go to our final stop?
No questions. Well, there was a question about the Unitarian Church, because you've mentioned it several times, and someone asked if it was still standing, and that it is still standing.
Yes.
It's at the corner of Elmwood and West Ferry, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure I got the right cross street. I can't remember.
Yes. And at the time, there was a particularly progressive minister at UU. His name was Paul Carnes. He was a national Unitarian leader and civil rights leader. He actually marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. And so he was very sympathetic to Mattachine meeting there, and if he hadn't given them space, right, they might not have survived as an organization given the climate of Buffalo at the time.
And then just a friendly reminder that it is 7:38.
Okay, 22 minutes, I can do it. So the final stop on our tour for this evening is 140 North Street in Buffalo, New York, which is located in the historic Allentown neighborhood just west of Delaware Avenue, and it's the site of the Lennox Hotel. The Lennox was originally known as the Lennox Apartment House, and it was designed by the architects Lovren and Whelan. It was constructed in 1896 as a 24 apartment building. And if we could go to the next slide, so this shows an illustration of the Lennox Apartment House around the time of its construction. And so in 1901, the property is actually transformed into a 48-room luxury hotel for individuals of economic means who are coming to Buffalo to visit the Pan American Exposition. And the exposition coincided with Buffalo's economic height, and the style and function of the Lennox reflected this with its elaborate and ornamental detailing that we can see here in the illustration. So at the time of construction, Lovren and Whelan described the Lennox as Venetian Gothic. However, from a contemporary architectural perspective, we would call this architectural style Chateauesque. And Chateauesque was briefly popular in the United States between 1880 and 1910. And it's based on the grand 16th century chateaus of France. And it contains a mixture of Gothic and Renaissance details. And Chateauesque is particularly characterized by It's busy roof lines, so it has a lot of elements like spires, turrets, excuse me, gables, metal crusting. We can actually see the metal crusting on the roof ridge of the Lennox, arch windows, arch doors. And so the first two stories of the Lennox are constructed of wash brick and terracotta, and the upper stories are buff brick and terracotta. The building is divided into two wings with a recessed courtyard in between. And in its original condition, the Lennox featured an entrance portico. Can we go to the next slide, which shows the portico? Thank you. So, portico is like roof that's supported by columns that functions as a porch. Essentially. So this portico has terracotta OG arches. An OG arch is an arch that has a serpentine or S-shaped curve that meets at an apex, Renaissance detailing, and a balustrade with finials. The building also features arch windows and doors with Renaissance detailing, molded cornices, excuse me, and then the metal crusting along the roof line that I mentioned. However, many of these character-defining features were removed upon subsequent remodelings of the Lennox, particularly in the 1940s and also in 2005 when the building was sold to new ownership. And so you can see in the photo here that the Lennox originally had steps. Those steps are significant to our story that's attached to this site. So we can go to the next slide. And the LGBTQ history that's attached to the Lennox involves a guy named Robert Uplinger, who also went by Bob or Bobby, who moved to Allentown in the 1970s to be closer to his own kind, Buffalo's gay community. He took up residence in the Somerset apartment building that's located at 228 Summer Street, just one block north of the Lennox. Bob was an out gay man. He grew up on Buffalo's west side, and he was secure in his sexuality from a young age. And he wanted to come to Allentown because beginning in the late 1960s, this neighborhood becomes associated with Buffalo's gay community, in addition to artists, musicians, and other bohemians. So Bob was only 5 feet 3 inches tall, but he had a big personality and a really nice mustache, if I do say so myself. He had an MA in elementary education and had a civil service job where he was working with troubled youth in the Buffalo schools. He was also a popular and well-known fixture in the gay Allentown crowd. And on the hot night of August 7th of 1981, the then 31-year-old Uplinger went out to a local gay bar looking for a companion for the evening. He wasn't successful, and as he's walking home along North Street around 3 a.m., he notices a really handsome guy that's sitting on the steps of the Lennox Hotel. And of course, those steps have now been removed and replaced by a semicircular driveway. And this section of North Street between Delaware Avenue and Irving Street, where the hotel was located, was a popular cruising area for gay men and also male and female sex workers. So Uplinger strikes up a conversation with this guy, and at one point in their conversation, a police car pulls up and asks them to move on. So they're leaving, and Uplinger is still, talking to this guy and invites him to come over, and the guy is resisting. And then Uplinger, is growing impatient, and he finally says, "Well, if you drive me to my house, I'll give you a blowjob." And those are the magic words, not because this guy wanted to make a sexual connection with Bob, because in fact, he was a Buffalo Police Department undercover vice officer, Stephen Nicosia, and he was part of an undercover campaign to scare gay men away from cruising in the residential areas of Allentown, because the police thought that these gay men are like selling the reputation of this historic neighborhood and terrorizing the heterosexual residents by flaunting their homosexuality in public. So if we go to the next slide, we can see Bob's mugshot and fingerprints here. He was booked for violating a section of the New York Penal Code, which prohibited, quote, loitering in a public place for the purpose to engage in deviant sexual intercourse or other sexual behavior of a deviant nature. Bob retains Buffalo attorney Bill Gardner, who had made a reputation for himself of representing gay men who were targeted by the BPD for sodomy or loitering charges. And Gardner was doing this work pro bono. Interestingly, in 1970, he had also represented Jim Garrow when he was going through his legal troubles with the BPD. So if we can go to the next slide here, the legal timeline. So Uplinger is actually convicted in the city courts in 1981. Now there's an earlier case here that was significant, People versus Onofre, that was a case coming out of Syracuse that involved a sodomy charge. And the result of this case was that New York State's consensual sodomy statute was overturned. Sodomy is this, really nebulous term that refers to, any sex act that doesn't result in procreation, but has historically been used to specifically target gay sexuality. So Bill Gardner's argument is that, well, if the sodomy statute is overturned and consensual sodomy isn't a crime, then surely you can ask someone to engage, right, in that sort of sexual activity with you, and you shouldn't be charged with loitering. So Uplinger Ray is convicted in the city courts. However, that decision is appealed, and the result is that the New York State Court of Appeals strikes down the statute against loitering for the purpose of soliciting deviant sexual intercourse. However, the district attorney appeals the case, asks the Supreme Court to review it. And they issued their opinion on May 30th of 1984, and they ultimately dismissed the case. So while the justices declined to rule on the merits in Uplinger, they did leave intact New York State Supreme Court ruling that people could not be prosecuted for asking others to have quote unquote deviant sex in the privacy of their own homes. Well, this is a landmark case. It's important to recognize that the Supreme Court's decision was not necessarily an affirmation of gay rights on the federal level, because just 2 years later in 1986, we see the case Bowers versus Hardwick, where the court in a 5-4 ruling upheld the constitutionality of a Georgia sodomy law. So from a legal perspective, at least, Bill Gardner had solved the problems of sodomy and loitering in New York State, and Bob Uplinger moves on with his life as well. He helps to found Gay and Lesbian Youth of Buffalo, now Gay and Lesbian Youth Services. He really had a knack with young people, and in 1986, though, he moves to Florida. And it's not long after he moves to Florida, if we could go to the next slide, that he dies from an AIDS-related illness, and he's only 35 years old, right? And by that time, the HIV/AIDS epidemic is ravaging gay communities across the country, including Buffalo. And to honor Bob's memory, several members of GLIB come together to create a quilt panel for him for the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. And they gather and construct this quilt panel at the home of Jim Haynes and Don Licht, 69 Johnson Park. So we're finishing where we started. The design, as you can see here, is a multicolor tree with heart-shaped leaves against a blue background. Bill Gardner made a heart with the scales of justice. Jim Haynes made a heart that said MSNF to symbolize Bob's involvement with the Mattachine Society at the Niagara Frontier. Don Lick's Heart says, love grandma, because Bob called him grandma. Mark Bozer made a heart with the glib logo, and Kate Gallivan, who's now the Senior Director of Grants Management at Evergreen, finally made a heart that depicted Bob with the young people from Glib gathered around him. And as you can see, someone sewed the N in Uplinger on backwards, and Jim Haynes's comment about that was that this is Bob having the last word. So because of Bobby Uplinger and his courage to take his case to court, gay people could walk the early morning streets of Allentown unharassed, although most people don't know his story. But Bob never really saw himself as a hero, and he always knew that there was a lot of work to do. And if we could go to the last slide, I'm going to follow what Jim Haynes says, and I'm going to let Bob have the last word here in terms of his story. This is from an interview that he gave about his case. So I've learned that you can lull yourself into a sense of false security, thinking that something like this only happens to somebody else. I did. I thought I lived in a pretty liberal neighborhood, never realizing that a few public officials could have such legal power to adversely affect people's lives. I've matured, no doubt. Fortunately, I've always had a gay consciousness that never needed raising. So I have one final slide. So as I mentioned, right in the 1980s, we're moving into a new phase of LGBTQ history with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This is a poster that was created in 1988 by the Silence Equals Death project. So the slogan Silence Equals Death and the pink triangle here becomes synonymous with the AIDS civil rights movement. And this was encouraging people to vote in the 1988 presidential election between George Herbert Walker Bush and Michael Dukakis. So I thought it was an apt image to finish with. It remains timely, right? And it encourages us to use our voice and to not squander our precious vote. Okay, I will end there.
Very, very wonderful and meaningful place to stop, especially since several people, as soon as we're done here, I'm going to watch some things on the TV that relate to what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
This was absolutely wonderful. Are there any questions out there? I think you've done just such a wonderful job at explaining these things, and that's possibly why there aren't that many questions. Just lots of praise for you in the captions.
I'm going to put in the chat a more detailed essay I wrote about Peggy Ames, because people seem to be interested in that. So that's there if people want to check that out.
Can you remind us of so you are a guest blogger for our web,
Yes.
for PBN and our gay places, but you also have articles other places too, right?
I do, and I can put my link tree in the chat.
That would be great.
I haven't updated it in a while, but there will be something relevant there.
And I just want to, again, in thanking you, Jeff, in doing this wonderful presentation to give us this, a wonderful look at these several buildings, but also as you drew the connections between these people and places, this, baseline of gay rights, gay liberation in Buffalo. Really wonderful history. And I would like to say again, I had some comments and conversations individually with people throughout the presentation. Our goal with this Gay Places initiative is not just to have pretty blogs and very long lectures that you can sit and learn wonderful information of. It is to turn this into action, just like Jeff was talking about politically. We want to take this information and to do those designations and other modes of celebration so that we can elevate these narratives and that they are not secret histories any longer. So with that and no other questions, again, thank you so much to everybody who are here, and I look forward to future lectures with Jeff on these topics in the future. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Have a great evening.